The storm had no mercy that night. Snow tore across the empty cemetery like shards of glass, slicing through the air, piling onto marble stones until even the tomb of the unknown soldier seemed to vanish under its weight. But 12 men stood, there, the guards of honor, frozen boots dug deep into the ground, faces pale, lips cracked, eyes red from the sting of the blizzard. Yet not a single one moved, because for them the oath was louder than the storm. The crowd that gathered behind the iron gates whispered nervously, "They can't survive this. They'll collapse before dawn, but they won't leave, will they?" And they didn't. Every hour the storm grew worse. Snow coated their shoulders like armor. Rifles trembled in their hands, not from fear but from the biting cold that cut through every layer of cloth and bone. Still, their formation never broke. Then a faint flicker of light appeared in the distance, a lantern, an old woman wrapped in a wool shawl, pushing against the violent wind. Her steps slow but steady. People gasped as she shuffled past the gates, clutching the lantern close, snow crunching beneath her boots. She stopped right before the guards, her face lined with age, her hands shaking, yet her eyes burning with a strange kind of fire. "Freeze out here," she said softly, her voice almost lost in the roar of the storm. "Come inside. My home is warm." The crowd held its breath. The guards said nothing. Their orders were clear. Their duty was eternal. But the woman did not turn away. She stepped closer, brushing snow from one guard's sleeve with trembling fingers. For a moment, it was as if she was touching her own son. The silence cracked not with words but with a feeling no storm could bury. A kindness stronger than tradition. A courage different from duty. And though the guards stood still, their eyes glistened. The world thought that night would be the end of them. Instead, it became the night the world discovered something greater. The strength of honor meeting the warmth of humanity. That what happened inside that tiny wooden house would shake the nation by morning. Because the next day, 100 officers knocked on her door. The storm had silenced the city. But inside the silence of the cemetery, 12 hearts beat like war drums. Among them stood Sergeant Michael Carter, 33 years old, eyes hardened not by cold but by memories he carried like scars. He was not just another guard on duty. He was a man who had already faced death yet chose to stand here, alive, guarding those who could no longer stand for themselves. Years ago, in a desert thousands of miles away, Carter had made a promise. His closest friend, Private James Holloway, had been struck down during an ambush. As the dust rose and bullets rained, James pressed his blood-soaked dog tags into Carter's hand. "If I don't make it, keep watch for me. Keep watch for all of us." That night haunted Carter. He lived. James didn't. And so he joined the elite brotherhood of the Tomb Guard silent sentinels who stood not just for a grave, but for every forgotten name carved into history. For Carter, this storm was nothing compared to the war inside his head. Each blast of wind reminded him of James's last breath. Each snowflake on his face was a whisper. Stand. Don't fall. Don't ever abandon post. But across town, another story brewed. The storm had delayed a scheduled ceremony, one attended by politicians who were always eager to be photographed in front of the tomb. Among them was Senator Richard Holden, a man known less for his service and more for his sharp tongue. He had often mocked the guards privately, calling them living statues and taxpayer ornaments. Tonight, the storm gave him new ammunition. As reports of the old lady's actions spread, her lantern, her kindness, her sneered ridiculous. "Soldiers are meant to serve orders, not old women with soup pots. Discipline is dying in this country." He didn't understand. He never could. Because for the guards, Arlington wasn't just landed, was sacred ground. Every stone was a heartbeat. Every blade of frozen grass whispered with ghosts. To stand here was to remind the world that silence can sometimes speak louder than speeches. The crowd that had gathered at the gates, families, veterans, reporters, felt that weight too. Some mothers pressed their children closer, whispering, "Remember this. Remember these men." An old veteran, his medals hidden under a tattered coat, muttered through chattering teeth, "I know that cold. I know that stare. They're fighting the storm the same way they fought the war without retreat." But then there was the woman. Her name was Margaret Ellis, 78 years old, widow of a World War II pilot. For decades, she lived alone in a small wooden house not far from the cemetery. Her husband had never returned from the skies, his body never found, only his name etched into a wall of remembrance. She knew what it meant to wait in the cold for someone who would never come back. That's why, when she saw the guards, her heart broke and her strength rose. "They can keep their posts tomorrow," she whispered to herself, clutching her lantern. "But tonight, they are someone's sons. Tonight I'll be their mother." And so she pushed through the storm. The background to this night was not just snow and silence, it was a collision of worlds. A soldier haunted by promises, a widow who refused to let others suffer what she once endured, and a politician, hungry for attention, ready to turn an act of kindness into an accusation of weakness. By midnight, the story had already begun to travel. Reporters texted updates, shaky videos appeared online, and across screens flickered the same image: 12 guards standing unbroken, and one fragile old woman holding a lantern against the storm. Some called it foolish, others called it heroic, but no one yet knew it was only the beginning. Because when duty, kindness, and arrogance collide, the world always watches. The storm raged deeper into the night. The cemetery gates rattled in the wind like iron chains, but the guards did not move. Their figures stood rigid, rifles at their sides, boots locked into the ground as if frozen into the earth itself. Margaret Ellis remained only a few steps away, her lantern swaying in the gusts, its flame struggling to live against the cold. She had placed her frail hand on the nearest guard's arm. Her lips trembled from both cold and determination. "You are not stone," she whispered, voice quivering. "You're men, and men need warmth." The guards did not speak. They could not. Their discipline was the language, but the silence was not shared by all. Through the crowd, a new voice sliced the air, a sharp, mocking laugh. Senator Richard Holden had arrived, wrapped in a heavy coat lined with fur. His aides trailed behind him, holding umbrellas against the storm as if the sky itself dared not touch him. His smirk carried the confidence of a man who had never faced the battlefield, yet loved standing near one when cameras were pointed his way. "Well, well," he called out, his words echoing against the marble walls. "What do we have here?" The mighty guards of honor protected by a grandmother with a lantern. Reporters' cameras clicked instantly, microphones thrust forward. The storm had turned into theater, and Holden wanted the lead role. They were supposed to stand eternal, he continued, pointing at the guards with his gloved hand. But now they hesitate. Now they let weakness, he gestured at Margaret, decide their duty. "Tell me, is this honor or is this shame?" A murmur rolled through the crowd. Some gasped in disbelief at his words. Others, cold and impatient, muttered, "He's right, it's pointless to stand out here. Tradition doesn't warm your blood." But veterans in the crowd clenched their fists, their jaws tightening. One old Marine, leaning on a cane, shouted back, "Don't you dare. Call them weak. You've never stood a day in their boots." Holden turned with a smirk, savoring the confrontation. He raised his voice, projecting so every camera caught his performance. "Oh, I respect tradition. I respect sacrifice. But what I see here is vanity, men too proud to admit they're just human, and a country too sentimental to correct them." The guards remained motionless, their rifles steady, their eyes locked forward, not even acknowledging the insults. Yet, something in the stillness felt louder than any outburst. The storm pounded harder, snow whipping sideways, stinging every bare inch of skin. Carter's vision blurred, but inside his chest his heart hammered with fire. Holden's words clawed at him, not because they struck true, but because they struck cruel. Carter remembered James, his fallen friend, his last whisper in the desert. "Keep watch for me." And so he did. He would keep watch, even if the world spat in his face for it. Margaret's frail figure swayed as the snow weighed down her shawl, yet her eyes cut like steel at Holden. She stepped closer to Carter, standing beside him as if daring the storm and the senator both. "They stand because others cannot," she said, her voice louder now, carried by the wind. "And if you can't see that, Senator, then perhaps it isn't them who are weak, it's you." The crowd gasped. Reporters snapped furiously, recording every word. Holden's smile faltered for the first time, his jaw tightening. He walked forward until he was nearly face to face with Carter, his polished boots crunching against the frozen ground. He circled the guard like a predator testing its prey. "Look at you," Holden sneered, lowering his voice so only the nearest reporters could hear, though he knew their microphones would catch it. "You think silence makes you strong? No, it makes you slaves to dead men's shadows, statues dressed in uniforms." Carter's body screamed to move, to shout, to defend his brothers, but he held his ground. The silence was his shield, his oath his weapon. But silence could not control the crowd. A young boy, no older than 10, tugged at his mother's coat. "Mum, why is he yelling at them? They didn't do anything wrong." The mother, her eyes wet with cold and anger, bent down and whispered, "Because sometimes people fear what they can't understand. Remember the guards, not him." Storm howled louder, drowning out some of the voices, yet Holden pressed on, sensing the weight of the stage. "You call this honor?" he shouted, his arms raised theatrically. I call it weakness wrapped in ceremony. And if this is what America holds sacred, then maybe America has forgotten what strength truly is. The words struck like stones. Some in the crowd lowered their heads, shamed or swayed. Others shouted back, anger boiling in their throats. Reporters jostled for better angles, their breath-fogging lenses as they captured every second. Margaret moved again, her lantern flickering. Wildly, she planted herself directly in front of Carter, her shawl flapping in the storm like a flag. Her voice cracked with age, but not with fear. You mistake stillness for weakness. But stillness is harder than you'll ever know. The crowd roared. In approval, some clapping despite the cold. Holden's face flushed red, his composure cracking. He stepped closer, the sneer on his lips sharpening into venom. His aides tugged nervously at his coat, urging him back, but he shrugged them off. Then he crossed the line. With one sharp motion, he reached out and shoved Carter's shoulder. The crowd gasped in unison, a ripple of shock breaking through the storm. Cameras flashed like lightning. The guards did not move. Carter did not flinch. His boots remained planted, his rifle steady, his gaze unbroken. Only the faintest twitch of muscle in his jaw betrayed the fire within. The silence after the shove was deafening. Even the storm seemed to pause. As if the earth itself held its breath, veterans clenched their fists. Mothers shielded their children, and every camera lens zoomed in tighter. Margaret whispered, her voice trembling with fury and awe, "Dear Lord, don't let him break." But Carter didn't break. He didn't even blink, and in that silence, the world began to realize this was no longer about snow, or duty, or even a storm. This was about something bigger, an unshakable resolve, colliding with arrogance in its purest form, and the night was far from over. The shove echoed like a gunshot, not in sound, but in silence. Every eye in the cemetery fixed on Carter, the guard who bore the insult. His shoulder had shifted slightly under Holden's push, snow sliding off his coat, but his boots had not moved. His rifle remained steady, his eyes fixed forward, as if the senator's hand had never touched him at all. The crowd gasped in disbelief. A woman stifled a scream. Reporters froze with cameras raised, fingers trembling over shutter buttons. Chuckled, though his laugh sounded thinner than before. See, nothing, not even a reaction, because they are not men, they are machines. Tradition has turned them into statues. But Carter's stillness was not emptiness. Behind his rigid stance was a storm fiercer than the blizzard itself. Every instinct screamed to strike back, to speak, to defend the sacred oath. Yet his training and his promise to James anchored him. Keep watch for me. Keep watch for all of us. The senator, emboldened by what he mistook for weakness, leaned closer. His breath steamed in the icy air as he whispered venomously into Carter's ear. You're not a hero, you're a prisoner, shackled by ghosts, who never cared about you. Carter's jaw tightened. His fingers twitched against the stock of his rifle. The crowd leaned in, waiting, praying for a reaction, and then Carter moved. It was not the movement Halden expected. Not an attack, not a retreat, but a single, deliberate action. He shifted his rifle to his left side, lifted his gloved right hand, and brought it up slowly, precisely into a flawless salute. The salute was not aimed at Halden. It was aimed at Margaret Ellis. The frail woman, clutching her lantern, stood trembling in the storm, eyes wide as Carter's hand rose in perfect, disciplined honor, not to power, not to politics, but to kindness. The crowd erupted not with cheers, not yet, but with gasps, a collective intake of breath that seemed to freeze the storm itself. Margaret's lips parted, her hand pressed against her chest. For a moment, the years fell away, and she was once more a young wife, watching her husband's squadron salute before disappearing into the clouds of war. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling down her wrinkled cheeks. The salute cut through the storm like fire through darkness. It said what no words could. It declared that honor bows not to arrogance, but to humanity. Holden staggered back a step, caught off guard. His smirk cracked, his face flushed with sudden rage. "Don't you mock me," he barked, his voice shrill now, stripped of confidence. But Carter didn't lower his hand. One by one, the other guards followed. 12 rifles shifted. 12 right hands rose. 12 salutes, sharp and steady, pointed not at the senator, but at the old woman who had defied the storm to offer them shelter. The crowd exploded. Veterans shouted, "Hoorah," at the top of their lungs. Mothers wept openly, hugging their children tightly. Reporters fumbled with cameras, desperate to capture the image that was already burning into history. Halden spun toward the crowd, enraged. "This is disgraceful. You cheer for weakness, for disobedience. These men have abandoned their duty." "No," a voice shouted back. It was the old Marine with the cane. His voice boomed louder than the storm. They've honored their duty more than you'll ever understand. The cheer spread like wildfire, applause, shouts, cries of honor, honor, echoing through the cemetery gates. Holden's face contorted. He turned back to Carter, his hands trembling with fury. Lower that hand, that's an order. But Carter's salute did not waver. His eyes remained locked forward, unblinking, unbroken. The storm pelted his face with snow and ice, but he stood unshaken. Margaret, tears streaming, stepped closer. She reached up with her trembling fingers and touched Carter's saluting hand gently, as though sealing the gesture with her blessing. Her voice cracked, yet carried with unshakable strength. Your honor is safe. Tonight, you are my sons. The crowd fell silent. Even the children stopped whispering. The storm howled around them, but in the center of that frozen graveyard, an unbreakable truth had been born. Holden backed away, his authority crumbling in the face of a silent defiance that no insult could tarnish. He sputtered words, cowards, fools, traitors, but they fell flat, drowned by the storm and the beating hearts of those who witnessed history. One final flash from a reporter's camera captured the scene. 12 guards saluting, a frail old woman with a lantern, while a furious senator stood powerless in the background. That image would circle the globe before dawn. But for Carter, it wasn't about cameras. It wasn't about politics. It was about James, about the promise he had kept, about proving that honor wasn't chance, it was freedom. As his hand remained in salute, he felt the weight of his friend's dog tags in his pocket. For the first time in years, the burden felt lighter. The turning point had come, not with words, not with violence, but with silence, steel, and a salute that shook the soul of a nation. The salute held. Seconds stretched into eternity, the storm screaming around them while 12 hands cut through the night in unison, aimed not at power but at the frail woman with the lantern. The world had frozen in awe. Then, as if a dam had burst, the silence shattered into thunder. The crowd erupted with cheers, shouts, and sobs. Veterans roared with pride, their voices hoarse but unstoppable. Mothers wept openly, clutching their children, whispering, "Remember this, never forget what you've seen tonight." The cameras flashed like lightning, every angle trying to capture the impossible. Living statues breaking the chains of silence, not with rebellion, but with a higher honor. Senator Holden stood at the center of it all, but not as he imagined. His face burned crimson, his fists clenched, his words drowned beneath the tidal wave of applause. He tried to shout, his voice cracking, "They've disgraced their oath. They've mocked tradition," but no one listened. The people had chosen their truth. And then the first phone buzzed in the crowd, then another. Screens lit up as reporters pushed footage to the world. Within minutes, the image was everywhere, broadcast live across channels, retweeted thousands of times, shared with captions that turned into a rallying cry. Stillness is strength. Honor salutes kindness. The night the guards stood taller. By dawn, the world would know. But even now, the power was undeniable. Aides tugged desperately at his sleeve. "Senator, it's over. We need to leave." He shook them off, snarling, his voice dripping with venom. "No, I won't let them win." But the people no longer looked at him. Their eyes belonged to Carter, to Margaret, to the unbroken wall of guards who stood against the storm. Margaret lowered her lantern slightly, her hand still resting gently on Carter's sleeve. Through her tears she smiled. "Your brothers would be proud," she whispered. Carter didn't speak, but inside, he felt the weight of James's dog tags like a heartbeat against his chest. For the first time in years, the guilt eased. His promise had been kept, not just to one man, but to a nation watching. Holden, desperate to reclaim control, barked orders at the police nearby. "Do your duty, arrest them for dereliction." But the officers did not move. Their faces were grim, their eyes unflinching. One stepped forward, saluted the guards, and turned to Holden. "With respect, Senator, they've honored their duty tonight more than any of us could." The crowd roared. Again, chants rising above the storm. "Honor, honor, honor." Holden's face twisted with rage and humiliation. He shouted once more, but his voice was drowned beneath the chant, swallowed by the storm. Finally, realizing his power had slipped beyond reach, he turned and stormed into the darkness, his figure vanishing into the snow like a shadow erased. By dawn, the guards did not lower their salutes until Margaret stepped back, tears streaming, and whispered, "Go, stand your watch." And so they did. One by one, 12 hands dropped back to their rifles. 12 boots pivoted sharply, heels clicking in perfect unison against the frozen ground. Their formation reformed, rigid and flawless, as if the storm, the shove, the insult, had never happened. The crowd hushed. Even children fell silent, watching the ritual with reverence. The guards marched back to the tomb, their steps crisp, their silence louder than thunder. Snow clung to their shoulders, their faces pale with cold, yet they moved with the grace of men untouched by chaos. To resume the watch after all that had happened was not just discipline, it was a declaration. Discipline was stronger than arrogance, honor was stronger than power, and silence, once mocked, had become the loudest voice of all. As Carter took his place once more at the head of the line, he drew a deep breath. The wind cut through him, but inside, he was burning with a strength no storm could smother. He tightened his grip on the rifle, his eyes fixed forward. Behind him, the crowd broke into applause again, this time not wild but reverent. A standing ovation in the snow, for men who had not moved, and yet had moved the world. The image would live forever. The night 12 guards saluted a widow, and in doing so, silenced a senator. The storm did not end that night, but something inside the people did. The anger, the doubt, the division, all of it melted beneath the silent power of 12 men who had refused to bend. By dawn, the cemetery lay blanketed in white. Snowdrifts curved like monuments themselves, soft and pure. The storm clouds thinned, streaks of pale orange breaking through the horizon. The air was sharp, but it carried with it a strange calm, the kind that comes after a battle survived. Guards still stood, their uniforms stiff with ice, their boots sunk deep into the frozen ground, but their formation flawless. The storm had not broken them, and yet, they had been changed. Across the gates, the crowd lingered, unwilling to leave. Veterans straightened their backs despite aching joints. Families clasped hands as if holding on to history itself, and reporters kept their cameras steady, unwilling to miss even a second. Then the crunch of boots echoed behind them. Dozens, hundreds of officers approached, their uniforms sharp, their badges gleaming under the pale light. One by one they lined the cemetery's edge, a silent wall of respect. Over 100 of them. At their head walked Colonel Samuel Whitaker, his silver hair dusted with snow, his eyes hard with military pride. He stopped before the guards, removed his cap, and raised his hand in a slow, deliberate salute. The crowd fell into reverent silence. When Whitaker lowered his hand, he turned not to the guards, but to Margaret Ellis. The old woman clutched her lantern, its flame still alive despite the storm, her shawl heavy with frost. She blinked in disbelief as the colonel approached her directly. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the weight of generations. "Last night, you did something no uniform, no command, no order could ever do. You reminded us what we're really standing for." Margaret's lips trembled. "I only offered warmth." Whitaker shook his head. "No, you offered courage. You offered humanity. And you reminded us that tradition means nothing without heart." Then, to the astonishment of the crowd, the colonel saluted her. Sharp, crisp, absolute. Behind him, over 100 officers followed. A sea of hands rising in perfect unison, not to a superior, not to a flag, but to a 78-year-old widow who had carried a lantern through a storm. Margaret's tears spilled freely, her frail frame shaking under the weight of so much honor. She whispered through sobs, "My husband, he never came home, but tonight I feel like he did." The colonel bowed his head, then stepped back, leaving the moment to the guards. Carter, still at his post, felt his throat tighten. He had not spoken in hours, but inside his chest words thundered. Slowly, without breaking formation, his hand slipped into his pocket. The cold metal of James's dog tags pressed against his fingers. He closed his fist around them, remembering his friend's last smile, his last promise. "If I don't make it, keep watch for me." Carter had kept watch. Not just for James, but for every fallen soul resting beneath the marble stones. And in that moment, for the first time since the desert, the guilt lifted. He drew a long, slow breath. His lungs filled with the icy dawn, but it felt warm inside him. He looked forward, as always, but his vision was clear now. Not blurred by grief, not haunted by loss. Clear somewhere behind the crowd, a child's voice broke the silence. "Mum, are they heroes?" The mother bent down, her own tears shining in the early light. She hugged her son and whispered, "Yes, and so is she." She pointed gently toward Margaret. The boy's eyes widened as he looked at the fragile woman standing strong among soldiers. He tugged at his scarf and whispered under his breath, as if sending the words to the wind itself. "Thank you." The words drifted through the crowd like a prayer, soft but powerful. They reached Carter's ears, and for the first time in years, the corners of his mouth twitched into the faintest, almost invisible smile. The dawn rose higher, golden light spilling across the cemetery. Snow sparkled like diamonds on marble stones. The storm had passed, but its memory would not fade. Not after this night, because what had happened was more than defiance, more than honor. It was proof that discipline and humanity were not enemies, they were brothers. And when they stood together, no storm, no insult, no arrogance could break them. The guards resumed their eternal watch. Margaret walked home slowly, lanterns still glowing, escorted by officers who treated her as if she were royalty. And Carter stood taller than he ever had before, his silence not empty, but full. In that silence lived a promise kept, in that silence lived James, in that silence lived honor, and the world would never forget. There are moments in history we forget, and there are moments we carry with us forever. A snowstorm, 12 silent men, a lantern in the hands of an old widow, and a crowd that came looking for a spectacle, but left having witnessed something far greater. What happened that night was not just a defense of a tomb or a tradition. It was a reminder that honor is not written in marble, it is carried in the living. It breathes in the stillness of a soldier who refuses to move. It glows in the lantern of a woman who has already lost more than the storm could ever take. The world often mistakes silence for weakness, but silence can be louder than thunder. It can break arrogance, it can humble the powerful, and it can remind us that true strength doesn't always shout, it endures. The tomb guards did not fight with weapons, yet they won a battle for respect, for memory, for every name carved into stone that would never speak again. And Margaret Ellis, fragile woman, proved that courage does not require youth or rank. Sometimes, all it takes is a lantern, a heart that refuses to yield, and the belief that tradition is worth protecting. When over 100 officers stood outside her door at dawn, saluting not her uniform but her humanity, they told the world something we should never forget. Honor is not given, it is lived. So the next time you see a soldier at their post, a veteran standing tall with medals across their chest, or even a grandmother who has carried loss with quiet dignity, what their silence means, it is not emptiness, it is sacrifice, it is strength, and it is a legacy that belongs to all of us, because traditions like these do not survive on marble alone. They survive in the stories we tell, the respect we pass on, and the way we choose to honor those who came before us. So, share this story, carry it forward. Let it remind you and those around you that stillness is not surrender, that tradition is not weakness, that silence is strength. And if this moment moved you, don't let it stay here. Honor it. Speak of it, share it, because some stories deserve to be remembered forever.